There's a list in Louisiana. You don't want to be on it. It has over 11,000 names, men and women and children, people who went out one ordinary day for an ordinary reason, and crossed some invisible line between the world where people see you and the world where nobody can find you. Some of them were taken, some of them were killed and hidden. Some of them walked into circumstances that closed around them, like the bayou closes around everything eventually, slow and absolute, and without any visible seam. Today we go into the files. We say the names, we ask the questions, subscribe, lock your doors, let's begin. It's November 10th, 1981. Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The kind of November that still feels like summer down south. The air is thick and warm, the way Louisiana air always is, carrying that smell of moss and river water that settles over the sis like a tech skin. The city is alive. LSU football season is still in the air. People are moving, laughing, living. The city hums, and somewhere in that hum, an 18-year-old girl makes a simple stop at her parents' house. She's picking up winter clothes, a routine errand, a 5-minute visit, and then she's gone. Let me tell you about Eleanor Parker before we talk about what happened to her, because she deserves more than a cold case number. Eleanor Celeste Parker was born December 6, 1962. She just turned 18 that November. She had dark blonde hair, blue eyes, stood 5 feet 5 inches, weighed about 115 pounds. Friends remembered her as the perfect Sandy from Grease, the kind of girl who always kept the room laughing. Bright, kind, the girl who made people feel seen. A friend named Yvette remembered a beautiful smile and a sweetness shown to everyone she met. Not the kind of description you use for someone complicated or reckless. The kind you use for someone who made the world slightly warmer just by existing. She was a recent graduate of Lee High School. She had a plan. The following spring, she was going to attend Louisiana State University. She had moved into an apartment in East Baton Rouge, with 3 female roommates just before her disappearance, a young woman starting out, building her own world. She also worked as a store clerk at Good Shows, a retail store near North 17th Street. She was doing all the right things. Getting a job, getting an apartment, planning for college. Eleanor Parker was doing everything exactly right. On the evening of November 10th, she made a stop at her parents' home in the South Downs neighborhood, a quiet residential part of Baton Rouge. She was picking up winter clothes. It was a brief visit, the kind where you pop in, grab a bag, say goodbye, and head out. The last thing anyone confirmed is that she was driving away from that house, heading in the direction of her apartment on Gardier Lane. The drive should have taken maybe 15 minutes. She never arrived. Now, here's where it gets strange. 4 days later, on November 14th, a former classmate claimed to have seen Eleanor at the Cortana Mall. The witness said she was wearing jeans and a gray Lee High School shirt with a blue football printed in the center. A shirt distinctly different from what she was wearing when she left her parents' house. The witness said they spoke, said Eleanor seemed fine. That sighting has never been confirmed, never been proven, never been disproven either. It sits in the case file like a question mark with no answer attached. Then, on November 18th, 8 days after Eleanor was last confirmed seen, her car was found. A 1975 Ford Maverick, parked alongside the road at North and North 17th Streets. That is near Good Shows, where she worked, near her job, not near her apartment, not near her parents' house. In a location that makes the trajectory of that last night impossible to reconstruct cleanly. But here's the detail that makes your brain stall completely. Her clothes were neatly folded in the trunk, not thrown in, not scattered in panic, neatly folded. Someone took the time to fold Eleanor Parker's clothes and place them in the trunk of her car. Think about what that means. Think about the care in that act, however it was performed, whether by Eleanor herself or by someone else. It is the most intimate and most disturbing detail in this entire case. Clothes, folded, left behind. There was no sign of struggle at the scene. No blood, no broken glass, no scratches on the car doors, no evidence that anything violent had happened in or around that vehicle. It was simply parked there, locked, silent, her clothes folded inside like laundry waiting to be put away. Let's stop right here and think about this, because the runaway theory falls apart the moment you hold it up to any light. If Eleanor had decided to leave, if she was running away from something or towards something, she would have taken her clothes. You don't fold your clothes, put them in the trunk of your car, and then flee barefoot into a new life. Especially not an 18-year-old who had just gotten an apartment, enrolled at LSU for the spring, and had a job she was actively working. She wasn't someone teetering on the edge of anything. She was building something. Let's talk about Baton Rouge in 1981, because the city itself is a character in this story. This was a time when Baton Rouge was growing fast, a university city with a sprawling social scene, neighborhoods transitioning, the kind of place where a young woman walking alone at night wasn't invisible, but also wasn't fully safe. The area around Guchoses on North 17th was commercial, not desolate, busy during the day, quieter at night. If Eleanor had been there in the evening, parking her car near her workplace, she wouldn't have been in total isolation. Someone should have seen something. The fact that nobody did, nobody came forward with anything concrete, means that whatever happened was swift, controlled, and deliberate. Investigators from both the Baton Rouge Police Department and the East Baton Rouge District Attorney's Office conducted parallel investigations. They interviewed nearly everyone in Eleanor's life at that time. They ran polygraph tests. They brought people in for lineups. They conducted a search spanning a 20-mile radius around her apartment. They distributed missing person flyers across the city, and they found nothing. No body, no blood trail, no witness who saw the critical moment, no evidence pointing cleanly at anyone. Now let's talk about the shadow that falls over this case from a different angle entirely. Baton Rouge in the 1980s through early 2000s was hunting ground for predators. The city has an extraordinarily dark history with missing and murdered women. Derek Todd Lee, who would later be known as the Baton Rouge serial killer, murdered at least 7 women in the region between 1998 and 2003. Sean Vincent Gillis killed multiple women in overlapping timeframes. After Lee's arrest in 2003, investigators found themselves staring at a list of approximately 60 unsolved cases of missing and murdered women in the Baton Rouge area, stretching back a decade or more. Eleanor's name is on lists that investigators have cross-referenced against these killers. But the math is stubborn. Derek Todd Lee was born in 1968, which means in November 1981 he was only 12 years old, too young. Sean Vincent Gillis's documented activity began in 1994, more than a decade after Eleanor vanished. So while the shadow of Baton Rouge's serial killer history falls over her case by atmosphere and geography, neither man fits the timeline for her specific disappearance, which means someone else did this. Someone who has either lived their entire life since 1981 carrying this secret, or someone who has since died, taking the answer with them. An investigator who later reviewed the files made a haunting statement about the case. He said he believed people knew where Eleanor was or where she had been. But the witnesses had aged, some had died, and the information that might have cracked the case open in 1981 was now locked inside people who were either unreachable or unwilling. He wanted to regroup with surviving original investigators, re-interview people who'd been in Eleanor's orbit back then. But time is the cruelest enemy of cold cases. Every year that passes takes witnesses with it. Eleanor's mother, Eileen Byrne Parker, died on June 9, 2008. She passed without ever knowing what happened to her daughter. The family's grief was of a specific and unbearable kind. The grief of permanent uncertainty, the grief of no grave to stand at, no answer to hold. Her obituary notes Eleanor in a way that suggests the family had long suspected she was gone, but had never received the confirmation that would let them mourn fully. Here's what I keep coming back to: the neatly folded clothes. Because that detail doesn't fit either major theory. If Eleanor ran away, you take your clothes. If someone abducted her violently from the road, there's no time to neatly fold anything. Neat folding suggests either a staged scene, someone trying to send a message or create a false narrative, or it suggests Eleanor herself folded those clothes in a moment before she made some kind of decision we still don't understand. Both possibilities are deeply unsettling. There is one more thread: the apartment on Gardier Lane. Eleanor had just moved in with 3 female roommates. We don't know, at least not from public records, whether those roommates were thoroughly cleared as witnesses, whether Eleanor had expressed fear about anyone in the weeks before she disappeared, whether she had noticed being followed or watched. She was a young woman new to independent life, new to navigating the world alone. Those first months of independence are also the months when you're most vulnerable, when you haven't yet built the instincts that come from experience. Modern investigators have noted that Eleanor's case carries enough remaining threads to potentially be solved. DNA technology has transformed cold cases that seemed sealed forever. Genetic genealogy, the technique of matching crime scene genetic material against public ancestry databases, has cracked open cases colder than this one. Eleanor's dental records and DNA profile are on file. If remains are ever found, identification is possible. If a suspect's genetic material exists somewhere in the evidence chain, a match could still be made. Eleanor Celeste Barker would be in her early 60s today, say, if she's alive. That is vanishingly unlikely. More probably, she has been gone since that November night in 1981, taken somewhere in those missing minutes between her parents' driveway and her apartment on Gardere Lane. She was 18 years old. She was going to college in the spring. She had an apartment and roommates and a job and a smile her friends still remember 40 years later. She stopped to pick up winter clothes. She folded something, or someone folded something, and her car sat parked near her workplace with her clothes inside, and the world kept moving without her. Her case file is still open. The answer is still out there, somewhere in the city where she lived and laughed and planned a future. But Baton Rouge keeps its secrets, and Eleanor Parker, the girl with the beautiful smile, has been missing for over 40 years. She's still waiting to come home. Picture Holden, Louisiana. Small, rural. The kind of place where your neighbors know what car you drive, what time you usually get your mail, whether your lights are on at the right hour. It's in Livingston Parish, that stretch of pine woods and flat land between Baton Rouge and the Mississippi state line. The kind of community where violent crime is theoretically impossible, because everyone knows everyone and strangers don't just drive in unnoticed. On May 2nd, 2008, it rained heavily. The kind of Louisiana downpour that turns gravel roads to mud and sends water sheeting off pine trees and walls. It was the kind of rain that washes things away. Barbara Blount was 58 years old, a widow living alone in her home on State Highway 1036 in rural Holden. She had graying brown hair, hazel eyes, wore eyeglasses. She was a woman who kept her own counsel, lived quietly, took care of her own business. Her daughter Christy had stopped by that morning before the rain started. That visit was brief, routine, the kind of check-in between a daughter and her mother that happens so often you stop noticing it until the day it becomes the last one. At 11:30 in the morning, Barbara spoke to a neighbor on the telephone. She was home. She was cleaning out her kitchen cabinets. Spring cleaning, the ordinary business of a May morning. She said she'd call again later. She never called again. When family members went to check on Barbara later that day, they found the front door wide open. Not forced, not broken, just open. The windows were open too. The house breathed with the humidity left by the rain. Inside, the kitchen was mid-project. Pots and pans were stacked on the floor, just as you'd expect if someone was cleaning out cabinets and getting organized. Everything was in the middle of something. The way a house looks when the person living in it stepped away, expecting to come back in 5 minutes. Her glasses were there. She wore glasses. She needed them. They were in the house. Her guns were there. Barbara owned guns, as many rural Louisiana women do. As a matter of practical safety, she didn't take them. Her phone was on the floor of the carport, with the battery knocked out or removed, fallen in a way that suggested it had been dropped or pulled from someone's hand in a hurry. And then there was the back door, wide open, no forced entry, no broken lock, no signs of struggle inside the house, just open doors, pots on the floor, glasses and guns left behind in silence. Her car, a 2006 Toyota Camry, was found the same day. It was discovered partially hidden on a logging road, a gravel path through the pine woods about a quarter-mile north of her home, less than half a mile from where she'd been cleaning her kitchen that morning. The keys were found separately, a few yards away from the vehicle, partially hidden, as though someone had pulled it off the main road and into the trees deliberately. A teenager discovered the keys near the car. That's when the search began. The FBI arrived. State police arrived. Livingston Parish Sheriff's Office deployed resources. Volunteers with search dogs swept the woods. The heavy rain that had fallen on May 2nd, the same day Barbara disappeared, had washed away fingerprints, destroyed trace evidence at and around the car, degraded whatever forensic record might have existed on that logging road. The single worst thing that could have happened to this investigation happened on the day of the crime. The skies opened up and cleaned the scene. Let's talk about what we know versus what we're being asked to assume. The open doors tell you two things. Either Barbara left in a deliberate hurry, leaving the house open in her wake, or she was taken so fast, so suddenly, that she didn't have the chance or the thought to close them behind her. The phone on the carport floor with the battery dislodged. That tells you something happened in the carport. Something jarring, something that ended with the phone hitting the ground. That's not the kind of thing that happens when you casually walk to your car to run an errand. The glasses are the detail I can't get past. Barbara wore glasses. She needed them to see clearly. You don't walk out of your house voluntarily without the thing you need to see. You don't leave for the store or the neighbor's house, or anywhere you intend to go without your glasses, unless the choice was made for you. Investigators determined quickly that there was no obvious motive of robbery. Nothing of evident value had been taken from the house. Her purse and wallet were accounted for. This wasn't someone breaking in to steal. This was someone who came for Barbara specifically. 2 railroad employees were later identified as possible witnesses. They were passing through the area around the time of Barbara's disappearance and reportedly saw something near where the car was found. Investigators believe what they saw was the person who discovered or moved the vehicle, and it took years to work through exactly what that sighting meant and whether it produced a viable lead. For a long time, even that thread sat cold. Then, in 2023, 15 years after Barbara Blount vanished, Sheriff Jason Ard went public with something rare in this case. He said there was new information, real new information. He described it as credible, described it as a piece of the puzzle, a development he was genuinely excited about. He was careful in his language, cautious about getting ahead of where the investigation was. But he said the words no one had been able to say for 15 years. He believed they were going to find Barbara Blount and find out what happened to her. He also said what anyone who has looked at this case knows without being told. He believes she was murdered. Here's what makes this case uniquely haunting. Barbara Blount was in the middle of something when she was taken. She wasn't at a nightclub. She wasn't on a highway at midnight. She wasn't anywhere that carries implicit risk. She was in her kitchen on a Friday morning, cleaning out her cabinets, making phone calls, living the quiet, ordinary life of a 58-year-old widow in rural Louisiana. She was home. She was safe. She was inside her own walls. And someone came through the door without breaking it and took her. The open door is not a metaphor, but it is one. Safety is not a place. Safety is not a set of circumstances you can control or predict. The doors of Barbara Blount's home were wide open on that rainy May morning, and something came through them. And whoever came through did so, knowing this woman's routine, knowing she was home alone, knowing how to move a car quietly into the trees, knowing how to disappear into the pine woods of Livingston Parish without anyone seeing the right thing at the right time. The rain was the accomplice. The logging road was the escape, and the silence of a rural community where people mind their own business was the cover. Barbara's daughter Christy has said publicly that the family knows no more now than they did the day it happened. That's more than 15 years of not knowing, of driving past the logging road, of wondering, of living in the geography of your mother's disappearance without a single answer to hold. The case remains open, the reward remains active, and somewhere in the pine woods of Livingston Parish, or in the memory of someone who knows something and has stayed quiet for 15 years, is the answer to what happened to Barbara Blount on a rainy Friday morning when she was cleaning her kitchen and the back door was unlocked and someone walked through it. She was 58 years old. She had her whole quiet, ordinary, valuable life ahead of her. She was cleaning cabinets she never finished. This one is different from the others. This one has a name. This one has a suspect who was found, arrested, and stared down the barrel of extradition back to Louisiana to answer for what he did. And then, in a Brazilian prison cell, he hanged himself, taking the last answer with him. Crystal Dupuy Grebinger has been missing since February 8th, 2013. She was 32 years old. Brown hair, brown eyes, a mother of 4 children. She lived in Breaux Bridge, Louisiana, that small Cajun town nestled along Bayou Techish, famous for crawfish and azaleas and the kind of community where your business is everybody's business, whether you want it to be or not. She had been married for 16 years to a man named Sean Carl Grebinger, 16 years, and by the end of those 16 years, something had gone profoundly, catastrophically wrong. Let me tell you what the court records show, because they are specific and they are damning. In November 2012, Crystal obtained a protective order against Sean. The language in that order is stark. She wrote that he had sexually assaulted her. She wrote that on one occasion he had tried to strangle her. She wrote that she was afraid for her life and the lives of her 4 children. The order required Sean to stay 300 feet from Crystal at all times. He allegedly violated it not once but twice. He was supposed to stay away from the woman he had tried to strangle, and he wouldn't. On January 14, 2013, Crystal filed for divorce. She had 4 children she loved. She had a custody hearing coming up. She was trying to build a wall between herself and the danger her marriage had become. She was doing everything the system tells women to do. Get a protective order. File for divorce. Go somewhere safe. That somewhere safe was Faith House, a shelter in Lafayette for victims of domestic abuse. She was living there at the time she disappeared. A shelter. A place designed specifically to protect women from the men who have tried to hurt them. On February 8, 2013, Crystal left Faith House. She stepped out that afternoon, and she never came back. Now here is the first thing that should silence the runaway theory before it even forms. Crystal had child custody hearings scheduled in the weeks following her disappearance. Multiple hearings. She was fighting to get her 4 children back. She had filed for divorce. She had built a legal case. She had done the work. Mothers who love their children do not walk away from custody hearings. They don't disappear the week they're supposed to be fighting for their kids in front of a judge. Her family knew this. When she didn't show up to the first custody hearing, they reported her missing on February 18th. The police began looking for Crystal, and almost immediately they began looking for Sean. He was gone. 2 days after Crystal was last seen, Sean Griebinger had disappeared from Louisiana. With 2 of Crystal's children, he had taken the kids and left the country. Investigators eventually pieced together the route. Sean had flown to Brazil, specifically to Sao Paulo, approximately 2 weeks after Crystal vanished. In Brazil, he did not lay low. He obtained residency by claiming, falsely, that he was an American Special Forces agent facing political persecution in the United States. He found a Brazilian woman and married her. He built a new life with a fabricated identity in a country that was, for years, difficult to extradite from. Crystal's 4 children were split. 2 were with relatives in Louisiana, with legal custody held by their grandmother. 2 were in Brazil with Sean. While Crystal's family searched and waited and held vigils and attended cold case conferences and kept her name alive, Sean Griebinger was living in South America, building a second life, using his children as cover, hiding behind a false biography. Crystal's body has never been found. No grave, no remains, no final location. The investigation went cold for years in the most painful way possible, everyone knowing who was responsible and having no way to reach him. And then, on January 31st, 2020, something cracked. The Brazilian city of Pouso Alegre, Sean Griebinger was arrested for domestic violence against his Brazilian wife. He had done to her what he had done to Crystal. The pattern had reasserted itself in a different country, in a different language, against a different woman. And this time it triggered a chain of events that Interpol had been quietly building toward for years. Brazilian federal police announced that Griebinger was wanted by Interpol in connection with the murder of his wife Crystal and the assault of his current wife. He was taken into custody. He was charged. He was transported to the Pouso Alegre prison to await extradition to the United States, where Louisiana's authorities had been preparing murder charges. Crystal's family released a statement. Her father, Randy Dupuy, had spent years speaking at cold case conferences, standing in hotel conference rooms in small Louisiana towns, showing photographs of his daughter to whoever would look. He had waited for this moment. Everyone who had followed this case had waited for this moment. Sean Griebinger in custody. Extradition authorized. The answer about to be compelled. And then, 3 days after his arrest on February 20th, 2020, guards at the Pouso Alegre prison were delivering breakfast to inmates. They found Sean Griebinger. He had made a makeshift rope from materials in his cell, attached it to the bars, and hanged himself. He was 48 years old. He left 3 letters, one to his mother, notes to friends. He spoke about his children. He asked someone to take care of them. He gave no location for Crystal. He offered no explanation for what he had done. He took everything he knew into the next world and left the family of Crystal Griebinger standing at the edge of an answer that closed itself at the last possible second. The DA's office in Lafayette said the investigation would continue. They were right to say it. An investigation does not end because the primary suspect dies. It narrows. It becomes more difficult. It loses its clearest path to the courtroom, but it doesn't end. The question of where Crystal Griebinger's body is remains open. Someone may know. Sean may have told someone. He may have returned to a specific location after Crystal disappeared that could be identified through records, through phone pings, through the memory of anyone who interacted with him in those days. Crystal was last seen wearing a black jumpsuit and black sparkly shoes. She had a tattoo on her lower back, a piece of ink that told the story of the marriage she was trying to escape. 4 children needed her, a divorce was filed, a custody battle was scheduled, a protective order was in place. Crystal Gribinger had done everything right, everything the system advised, and the system failed to put enough distance between her and the man who had tried to strangle her. The word that keeps returning in this case is tattoo, property of Sean Gribinger. Written on her body in permanent ink, an inscription from the years when she may not have known how literal that possessiveness would become. She was trying to erase it, legally and physically and spiritually. She was getting out. She filed the paperwork. She went to the shelter. She attended the hearings. She was 32 years old. She had 4 children and a new start waiting for her. She stepped out of a shelter for abused women on a February afternoon in Lafayette, Louisiana, and the man she was trying to leave was already gone, already running, already building his lie in South America. Crystal Grebinger's body has never been found. Her case remains open. Her father still speaks her name at conferences and vigils. Her children, some of them grown now, grew up with this absence at the center of their lives. And in a prison in Pouso Alegre, Brazil, the man who could have ended the search chose instead to end himself. The answer is still out there, somewhere in Louisiana, or in the records of a man who lived a double life on 2 continents. The location of Crystal Gribinger is waiting. Her family deserves to bring her home. Her children deserve to know where their mother is. Crystal Gribinger was everything right. She was getting out, and she almost made it. It's June 1997 in Baton Rouge, and the heat is the kind that makes you not want to move. The Louisiana summer has fully arrived, the air wet and pressing, the kind of heat that sits on your chest. The LSU campus is in summer session, quieter than its autumn chaos, but still alive. Students move between buildings. Joggers circle the university lakes, that flat stretch of water at the edge of campus where people walk and run and think and breathe. It's the kind of setting that feels safe. That's important. Remember that Eugenie Boisfontaine was 34 years old in June 1997. She had mousy blonde hair, a round-tipped nose, and according to people who knew her, a personality so quiet and unobtrusive that investigators later struggled to get detailed information about her from her own acquaintances. Not in a suspicious way. In a way that suggests she moved gently through the world, not demanding attention, not generating drama. She was the kind of person who was simply present, good, unflashy. She was a divorced woman. She'd been married, the marriage had ended, and now she was starting over at 34, starting over in Baton Rouge. She had enrolled in graduate school at Louisiana State University, building something new. She lived in a garage apartment at 2009 Stanford Avenue, a quiet residential street near the LSU campus, across the lake. She had a routine. She took walks around the university lakes. It was exercise, yes, but also probably something more than that. Those walks around the lake with the flat water and the long stretch of sky feel like something a person in the middle of rebuilding herself would do. Meditative. Forward-facing, she was also planning a trip to Europe. Something to look forward to. A graduate student, a fresh start, an upcoming adventure. That's the life Eugenie Boisfontaine was living in June 1997. The last confirmed sighting of Eugenie came from an exterminator who visited her residence on June 13, 1997. He saw her at her home on Stanford Avenue. That's the last moment anyone definitively placed her alive. She was there, she was home, and then she wasn't. The following day, June 14th, a jogger found something near the university lakes, the same lake path Eugenie was known to walk. The jogger found her driver's license and credit cards, not dropped carelessly, found there on the path near the water. A visiting professor who was also using the lake path discovered more of her credit cards. And here is the detail that has haunted this case since 1997. The professor found her cards arranged in a circle, not scattered, not dropped in a struggle, arranged, placed in a deliberate circle near the lake. Why? What does that mean? Was Eugenie leaving a message? Was someone leaving a message? Was it chaos that looked like order? Nobody knows. The credit cards arranged in a circle are one of the most discussed and most inexplicable details in this entire case. 3 days later, on June 17th, a private investigator hired by Eugenie's family, who had come to Baton Rouge after not hearing from her, found her keys near the lake, close to where the credit cards had been found. The family had come to check on her, found the basket with her belongings at her door, reported her disappearance to police, hired a private investigator out of urgency rather than patience with official timelines. Think about that. Her family came to Baton Rouge because she'd gone quiet, found her belongings staged at her door, hired a private investigator before the case had even fully been processed. That's not the behavior of a family dealing with someone who ran away. That's the behavior of people who knew immediately that something was profoundly wrong. Search parties combed the area around the lakes. Police searched. Volunteers searched. Eugenie's family searched. For weeks there was nothing. And then, in August 1997, more than 2 months after she disappeared, a woman's discovered a body. The location was Bayou Manchac, a waterway about 15 miles south of Baton Rouge in Iberville Parish. The body was decomposing. It was leaning up against a tree on the Iberville Parish side of the bayou. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, a fractured skull. Eugenie Boisfontaine had been beaten to death. The body had been there for months. The bayou held her while the city searched for her, while her family waited, while her detective lit candles in a dark room and promised her mother he would find the answer. His name was Rody Sanchez. He was the first investigator assigned to Eugenie's case in 1997. He worked it, ran down every lead, interviewed every person of interest, and came up empty. No arrest was ever made, and Rody Sanchez, by his own account, never stopped thinking about it. He kept a photograph of Eugenie by his desk every single day of his career. He made a promise to Eugenie's mother that he would find the person responsible. Her mother died without receiving that answer. That broke something in Sanchez that never quite healed. Now let's talk about suspects, because this case has orbited around several. Baton Rouge in the late 1990s was a hunting ground for killers. Derek Todd Lee was active in the region from 1998 forward, murdering at least 7 women. Sean Vincent Gillis was active from 1994 through 2004, killing multiple victims, whose bodies were often found in rural areas, often near water, often in advanced states of decomposition. When Eugenie's case first fell onto investigators' desks, the instinct was to ask whether she fit into the pattern of either man. But here is where the analysis gets careful. Eugenie disappeared in June 1997, which is before Derek Todd Lee's documented murder timeline begins. The lead investigator who revisited the case decades later said with confidence that Lee had nothing to do with Eugenie's death. As for Sean Vincent Gillis, the timeline overlaps and the geography overlaps, but no hard evidence ever connected him to Eugenie. His MO involved necrophilia and mutilation, elements that were not present or identifiable in Eugenie's badly decomposed remains. 2 other individuals drew sustained investigative attention. There was a man named Robert, an unidentified boyfriend whom Eugenie had been seeing around the time she disappeared. Details about him remain vague in public records. And then there was her ex-husband, Michael Schmidt. When the Discovery Channel series Killing Fields reopened this case in 2016, with Rody Sanchez coming out of retirement to work it publicly in real time, Schmidt became a focal point. The investigators attempted to obtain his DNA for comparison against any genetic material found. He showed up to that meeting with 3 criminal defense attorneys. He refused to provide a sample. Let that land. You are being asked to provide a D swab to rule yourself out in your ex-wife's murder. You arrive with a team of defense lawyers. You say no. You argue that no one told you she was dead until recently. A man who shared a life with Eugenie Boisfontaine claimed he didn't know she had been murdered for nearly 2 decades. Whether that's true or false, it is a peculiar statement to make. The Killing Fields investigation did produce new leads. New DNA was uncovered during the filming of the series, a development that generated real excitement. Investigators were also digging into Eugenie's financial records, tracing insurance policies, following threads that hadn't been pulled on before. But the cameras eventually stopped rolling, the show moved on, and no arrest was ever made. Investigators also noted something that colors the geography of this case. The area around Iberville Parish where Eugenie's body was found is characterized by remote, densely vegetated terrain near water, the kind of place where someone familiar with the region would know to go. Not a tourist, not an outsider, someone who knew the bayou. There's a detail about Eugenie's life on Stanford Avenue that deserves attention. She lived in a garage apartment, somewhat isolated, on a quiet residential street. She walked the lake path regularly, alone, as part of her routine. Someone who knew her routine, or someone who watched her enough to know it, could have planned around it. The credit cards arranged in a circle near the lake suggest the abduction happened there, near the water, near the path she walked. Whether she was attacked on that path or drawn there by someone is unknown. Eugenie was reportedly planning to travel to Europe. Her bags may have been partially prepared. Her mind may have been on the future, on the trip, on the next chapter after the divorce and the graduate school admission and the new apartment. She was looking forward, and somebody ended that. Her brother, who spoke publicly during the Killing Fields investigation, was cautiously hopeful. He said the renewed attention had produced real inquiries, possible new leads. He wanted to believe the case could be solved. He wanted to give his family the answer their mother never received. Rodi Sanchez, the detective who could never let this go, said it in the simplest possible terms. He kept her photo on his desk every day as a reminder that the job wasn't finished. That's what this case does to people. It won't let go. Eugenie Boisfontaine was 34 years old. She was divorced and starting over in graduate school. She was walking the university lakes, making plans for Europe, building a life that had been briefly interrupted, and now was going to be something new. She was leaning against the beginning of something, and someone turned that into an ending. Her body was found leaning against a tree in a Louisiana bayou 15 miles from the city where she disappeared. The bayou held her for 2 months while the city searched, and 25-plus years later, nobody has ever been charged. Nobody has sat in a courtroom and answered for what happened to Eugenie Boisfontaine near the university lakes on a warm June evening in 1997. The case remains open. The answer is out there, and the bayou is still quiet. There's a town in southwest Louisiana called Jennings. Population roughly 10,000. Oil country, crawfish country. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the same families have lived on the same land for generations, where the local police chief's cousin went to school with the woman who runs the diner, who dated the man who knows the deputy. It is a tightly woven, generations-deep web of connection and loyalty and silence. Between 2005 and 2009, 8 women were murdered in Jefferson Davis Parish. 8 women, 4 years. A small town. Their bodies were found in the swamps, the canals, the shallow crawfish ponds surrounding Jennings, dumped in the water that sustains this region, in the flat brown Louisiana water between the mesquite trees and the oil pump jacks. Left in the landscape like they were nothing. They were not nothing. Let me tell you who they were. Loretta Lynn Chasen Lewis was the first. Her body was found in 2005. She was young, and she was a person trying to survive in a system that had not made survival easy for her. Then came Ernestine Daniels Patterson, then Kristen E. Gary Lopez, then Whitney Charlene Dubois, then Laconia Chantel Brown, known as Muggy, then Crystal Shea Benoit Zeno, then Brittany Gary, and finally, in 2009, Nicole Jean Guillory, who died less than 2 weeks before her 27th birthday. She had told her mother not to bother buying a birthday cake. She said she wouldn't be alive to eat it. She said the police were responsible for the other women's deaths. Think about that. A young woman telling her mother she is going to die, telling her who she believes is responsible, and then dying, and those responsible still walking free. The 8 women ranged in age from 17 to 30. Most of their bodies were found in states of decomposition, significant enough that determining cause of death was difficult. Some appeared to have been asphyxiated. 2 had their throats slashed. The methods varied. The water in the swamp concealed evidence the way only Louisiana swamp can conceal evidence, absorbing everything, giving back nothing clean. Now, the official story presented to the public was that a serial killer was operating in Jefferson Davis Parish. Law enforcement told the community they were looking for one person, a single predator, stalking the margins of Jennings. Resources were framed around finding that one person. Warnings were issued, and years passed with no arrest and no progress. Then journalist Ethan Brown arrived in 2012. He spent years investigating these murders, reviewing thousands of pages of previously unseen homicide files, following threads into places that made people deeply uncomfortable. And what he found, what he documented in his book and the Showtime docuseries that followed, was not a story about a lone serial killer. It was a story about a town where the victims knew too much about the local drug trade, where several of them had been police informants, and where the people best positioned to investigate the murders may have had reasons not to want them solved. Let's talk about the Boudreaux Inn. It was a cheap motel in Jennings, the kind of place where you pay by the week if you're between nowhere and nowhere. Several of the 8 women worked the motel, engaged in sex work that brought them into regular contact with men from all levels of Jennings society, including law enforcement. The motel was known to local police. Arrests were made there regularly. The women who worked there knew the deputies, the officers, the people in uniform who were supposed to protect them, and those same women ended up dead. A man named Frankie Richard was a local figure, a pimp and drug dealer who had direct connections to several of the 8 women. He was scrutinized. He was investigated. He was never charged. Evidence linking him to the murders was not sufficient to prosecute. But here's where this case fractures into something far more disturbing than a typical serial killer story. An officer named Jesse Ewing began gathering evidence that something was deeply wrong within the investigation itself. He was approached by witnesses, people willing to speak but afraid to speak to certain people. They told Ewing on recorded audio that higher-ranking officers had been involved in covering up the murders. Ewing didn't trust the internal chain, so he took those recordings to a private investigator who gave them to the FBI. The FBI turned them directly over to the local task force, the very people Ewing didn't trust. And then Ewing was charged with malfeasance in office and sexual misconduct, and was terminated after 20 years of service. The recordings were not released publicly. The information on them was corroborated by other investigative interviews in which witnesses claimed law enforcement involvement in the deaths. None of that was made public until years later. Then there is the congressman. Journalist Ethan Brown reported that Louisiana Congressman Charles Bustani had allegedly had sexual contact with 3 of the 8 victims at the Boudreaux Inn. That is not a fringe rumor or an anonymous accusation. That is a specific claim made by a journalist after years of documented investigation, built from interviews and records. The women this congressman allegedly had contact with are now dead. Dead and unsolved. Here's what you have to understand about the way power operates in a town of 10,000 people. There is no anonymity. There is no clean line between criminal and official. The same man who arrested you last Tuesday might be at your neighbor's barbecue on Saturday. The web of relationships in a small Louisiana parish is thick enough to hide almost anything. And the people who most needed protection from that web were the people the system had already decided didn't matter. Sex workers, drug users, women on the margins, women whose deaths would not generate the same media outrage as a college student or a suburban mother. Muggy Brown, one of the 8 women, told her family before she died that she was working as an informant on murder cases. The officer she named as her contact handler was Michael Janice. The person who found Muggy Brown's body was Michael Janice. The officer she said she was informing for was the man who found her. That is either the most extraordinary coincidence in this case, or it is the dark center of the entire thing. Nicole Guillory, the final victim, told her mother she would not live to see her birthday. She identified law enforcement as the source of danger. She died 10 days before her 27th birthday. Her mother bought no cake. No one has answered for Nicole Guillory's death. A multi-agency task force composed of federal, state, and local law enforcement was finally assembled in December 2008 after 7 women had already been found. The media arrived in Jennings. Cameras, reporters, the national spotlight that a small Louisiana town had never wanted and didn't know how to handle. The investigation produced no arrests. Years continued to pass. Part of the investigative dysfunction in these cases stems from the nature of where the bodies were found. The swamps and canals around Jennings are perfect disposal sites. Louisiana crawfish ponds are shallow and regularly serviced. A body placed there will be discovered eventually, but will also be damaged by the environment and by the agricultural work done around those ponds. Evidence dissolves in that water. Trace material disappears. The landscape is, in the most literal sense, an accomplice. And the victims themselves were, in the eyes of official systems, low priority. They were sex workers. They were drug users. They were women of color and poor white women without the social capital that generates pressure on police departments. When a woman from a prominent family disappears, the community mobilizes. The media shows up. The mayor makes statements. When a woman from the margins of a small Louisiana town disappears, the report gets filed, and sometimes that's where it stops. Ethan Brown's investigation, and the documentary work that followed, put pressure on this case that it had never faced before. The Showtime series Murder in the Bayou brought these 8 women's faces to a national audience. Their names were said out loud in places where they'd never been said before: Loretta, Ernestine, Kristen, Whitney, Laconia, Crystal, Brittany, Nicole. 8 names, 8 lives, 8 murders, all unsolved. As of the writing of this script, no one has ever been charged in any of the Jeff Davis 8 murders. Not Frankie Richard. Not anyone connected to law enforcement. Not a single person. 8 women were murdered in a 4-year span in a town of 10,000 people, their bodies disposed of in the surrounding water, and the machinery of justice in Jefferson Davis Parish produced nothing. There is a question that sits at the center of this case that cannot be answered by pointing at a single predator. If these women were killed because they knew too much about the local drug trade, because they were informants, because they saw things that dangerous people needed buried, then their deaths were not the work of one serial killer driven by compulsion. They were executions, managed, deliberate, protected by silence and complicity, and the power of men who wore badges and lived in a town small enough that everyone knew everyone and no one could afford to speak. The crawfish ponds are still there. The canals are still there. Jefferson Davis Parish is still there. And the 8 women, Loretta and Ernestine and Kristen and Whitney and Laconia and Crystal and Brittany and Nicole, they are still waiting for someone to finally answer the question that everyone in that small, tight, suffocating little town already knows the answer to. Who killed them? And why is that person still free? It's October 26, 1991. Bossier City, Louisiana, the smaller city across the Red River from Shreveport, the one that people who aren't from Northwest Louisiana often fold into its bigger neighbor without knowing the distinction. But Bossier City has its own character, its own geography, its own particular mix of military base proximity and honky-tonk nightlife, and the kind of flat, neon-lit strip development that defines the American commercial landscape of the early 1990s. Cowboys nightclub sits on Gould Drive. It's the kind of place that was everywhere in that era. The country-themed nightclub with the mechanical bull on the dance floor and the Garth Brooks on the jukebox, and the crowd that comes in wearing boots and comes out smelling like cigarette smoke and spilled beer. It has since changed its name and its identity, the way those places always do. But in October 1991, Cowboys was where you went on a Saturday night in Bossier City. Penny Madanat had a reason to go out that night, a real specific happy reason. She had just received her first paycheck from ProCuts, the hair salon on Airline Drive in Shreveport, where she had recently started working. She had just earned her cosmetology license. She was a newly qualified stylist who had gotten a real job at a real salon, and the check in her hand was the first material proof that she had done it, that the training had paid off, that she was starting something new. Let me tell you about Penny before that night, because she was more than the circumstances of her disappearance. Penelope Marie Nun Madanat was 23 years old. She had auburn hair and blue eyes and wore braces on her teeth. She had a birthmark on her left arm shaped. Some descriptions say, like the letter H, and a small mole above the right side of her lip. She stood 5 feet 7 inches and weighed 128 pounds. She was a graduate of Woodlawn High School. She was a mother with a 4-year-old named Keith and a 2-year-old named Sarah. She was separated from her husband, a Jordanian-born man named Akim Madanat, who went by Eddie. The marriage had not ended cleanly. She was living in Bossier City with the children, trying to build the next chapter. The cosmetology license was the key to that chapter. The paycheck was the first day of the rest of her life. A clerk at a restaurant near Cowboys told investigators that Penny came in late that night. She asked for change to make a call from a payphone. This is critical. She was alive after she left the car. She was trying to reach someone. She was trying to call for help, or to call someone she trusted, or to arrange a way to get back to her children, who were home with her sick daughter and her sister. She was actively trying to solve the problem she'd been put in. She walked into a restaurant. She asked for change. The clerk noted that a dark-colored vehicle was parked outside the restaurant during this time. A dark-colored vehicle, parked outside, while the woman who had just been in an argument with her estranged husband was inside asking for change. Penny Madanat has never been heard from again. She never made that call to whoever she was trying to reach. She never came back to her children. She never showed up for another shift at ProCuts. She never got to tell Keith and Sarah that she got her license, that she was building something for them, that the worst part was over and the new part was beginning. Now let's talk about Eddie, because this is where the case stops being mysterious and starts being infuriating. Shortly after Penny disappeared, Eddie Madanat sat down with investigators and took polygraph examinations. He failed 2 of them. Not borderline results, not ambiguous readings. Failed. The specific language used by law enforcement is that the exams indicated extreme deception. A detective who worked the case stated that Eddie was a person of interest based on those 2 failed polygraphs, that authorities believed he knew what had happened to Penelope, and that they considered him a possible suspect. And then Eddie Madinat took the couple's 2 children and left the country. He went to Jordan. He took Keith and Sarah, Penny's 4-year-old and 2-year-old, the children she had separated from Eddie in order to protect. He carried them across an ocean to a country that does not have an extradition treaty with the United States. He cannot be compelled to return. He cannot be brought to Louisiana for further questioning. He cannot be seated in front of investigators who have new questions and new evidence and technologies that didn't exist in 1991. He is, according to the last known information, living in Amman, Jordan, reportedly now on a 4th wife, having apparently been in prison in England at some point. A man whose history with women is a litany of red flags waving in a wind that nobody in authority can reach across international boundaries to feel. Penny's mother, Matthewina Butler, waited for her daughter for years. She kept the case in the media, kept the name Penny Madinat alive in the public consciousness of Bossier City through sheer force of will and grief. Her daughter Marty, Penny's sister, the one who was supposed to go to Cowboys that night but stayed home with the sick baby, kept fighting too. Marty passed away without ever knowing what happened to Penny. She died carrying that. Her mother kept waiting. There is a connection that investigators pursued and never fully resolved. In June 1990, about a year before Penny disappeared, a man named Anthony Dixon, 22 years old, was found murdered along Highway 1. His body had been decapitated and partially burned, left beside his vehicle. Eddie Madinat was questioned by authorities in Hot Spring, Arkansas, in connection with Dixon's murder. The nature of that questioning, what exactly Eddie said and what investigators found, is not fully in the public record, but the connection was investigated seriously enough that appeared in reporting about Penny's case, suggesting that law enforcement saw a possible thread between Eddie and an unsolved murder with characteristics of extreme violence, the kind of violence that goes far beyond a simple crime of opportunity. A man who fails 2 polygraphs, a man who flees to an extradition-proof country with his estranged wife's children, a man who was questioned about a beheading. These are the facts in the public record. Penny Madinat was wearing an initial ring when she left Cowboys that night, a ring with the letter PP, her letter, her name, her identity worn on her hand. She never came back for it. The ring she wore that night went wherever she went, into whatever darkness closed around her on Gould Drive in the small hours of October 27, 1991. Her children Keith and Sarah are in their 30s now if they are alive. They grew up in Jordan without their mother, raised by a man who failed 2 polygraph examinations about her disappearance. What they know, what they remember, what they believe, and whether they would speak if asked, are questions that belong to a family scattered across an ocean by a crime that may never be fully prosecuted. Bossier City is still there. The club on Gould Drive has changed its name. The restaurant where Penny stopped to ask for change is gone or unidentifiable now. The payphone she was heading for, the phone that might have connected her to safety, is long dismantled. But the case is not closed. Bossier City Police have said publicly that no missing persons case is ever considered closed until the person is found. Penny Madinat has not been found. Eddie Madinat has not been brought to Louisiana. The initial ring with the letter P is somewhere in the world or lost. She was 23. She had 2 children. She had her cosmetology license and her first paycheck and her whole professional life just beginning. She went out to celebrate alone because her daughter was sick and her sister stayed home, and she had earned this. She had earned a night out. And somewhere between the parking lot of Cowboys and a payphone on Gould Drive, someone made sure she never used it. It's October 30th, 2020, the height of a global pandemic, a Friday evening in Baldwin, Louisiana, a small community in St. Mary Parish down in the Atchafalaya Basin country where sugarcane fields stretch flat and wide under the South Louisiana sky. Baldwin is the kind of place you drive through without slowing down, small enough to pass in a blink, the kind of community where the life is lived behind the houses and along the bayous rather than on the main road. Bobby Charles was 15 years old. His real name was Quawan, but everyone called him Bobby. He lived with his father, Kenneth Jacko, in Baldwin. He had recently transferred schools, starting the year at Southside High in Youngsville before moving to West St. Mary High. That school transition is a detail worth holding. A 15-year-old navigating a new school environment in the middle of a pandemic, trying to find his footing in an already scintillating time, when every teenager in America was stripped of the normal social scaffolding of school and sport and gathering. On the evening of October 30th, Bobby left his father's house. He left with a woman named Janet Irvin and her 17-year-old son, Gavin. His parents say they did not know Janet Irvin. They did not consent to their son leaving with her. Bobby was picked up outside his father's house and he was gone. He was 15. He was in an unfamiliar area. He was with people his parents didn't know. And the world was in the middle of a pandemic that had reduced all ordinary oversight to near zero. That same night, Bobby's parents reported him missing to local police. And here is where the story of this case fractures into something that goes beyond a single missing teenager. The department, according to family attorneys, gave no indication they were investigating it. No immediate active search. No Amber Alert. A 15-year-old black child reported missing from his father's home in rural Louisiana, taken by people his parents didn't know, and the machinery of a emergency response did not activate. No Amber Alert. Police would later claim all procedures were followed. 4 days passed. 4 days of silence and no progress visible to the family. And then on November 3rd, 2020, Bobby's body was found in a sugarcane field near the village of Laroville, in Iberia Parish, approximately 20 miles from his father's home in Baldwin. He was found in a field of sugarcane, the crop that defines this landscape, the tall, stalked green walls that line the rural roads of South Louisiana, the crop that has its own brutal history in this part of the country. When Bobby's family saw photographs of the scene, they released them publicly. What was visible in those photographs, the condition of Bobby's face and body, generated an immediate explosive national response. The images were disturbing in ways that go beyond what any family should have to share. And yet the family shared them deliberately. It's because they wanted the world to understand what they were looking at. The preliminary autopsy from the Iberia Parish Coroner's Office determined the most likely cause of death was drowning. The reports said there was no evidence of ante-mortem trauma, no pre-death injury. It noted that any marks on the body could be attributed to the autopsies itself or to aquatic animals, since the body was found in water in a sugarcane field. Bobby's family and their attorneys immediately challenged this conclusion. Ronald Haley, one of the attorneys representing the family, made a point that has stayed in this case ever since. He noted that the bodies of water in that sugarcane field barely go up to your knees, that this isn't water deep enough to drown someone who is not incapacitated, that this doesn't just happen to a 15-year-old who accidentally wandered into a sugarcane field in the dark. Let's talk about the logistics of drowning in a sugarcane field. Sugarcane fields in this part of Louisiana are crisscrossed by shallow irrigation ditches and drainage channels. They are flat and dense, the cane growing taller than a person in peak season, creating a kind of disorienting maze if you're inside one at night. The water in those ditches is shallow, a few inches to at most a foot or two in the deepest parts. For a 15-year-old to drown in that water, he would have to be face down, incapacitated, unable to simply lift his head. He would have to be held there, or he would have to be so deeply unconscious that gravity and inches of water were sufficient to kill him. The Iberia Parish Sheriff's Office classified the investigation as a homicide. Their statement was specific. They said that from the very moment they found Bobby, they treated it as a homicide investigation. That classification is significant. It means the official determination by the investigating agency was that something had been done to this boy. Not that he drowned accidentally, not that he got lost and stumbled into water, that he was killed. Authorities said they had surveillance video showing Bobby alone near where his body was later found. That video was not released publicly. They said they had conducted interviews with people who were with Bobby before his disappearance. Janet Irvin and her son Gavin, the two people who took Bobby from his father's house, had, according to attorneys, packed up and left their home by the time the national spotlight arrived. Janet Irvin was eventually charged, not with Bobby's death. She was charged with failure to report a missing child and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. She was not charged with homicide. Bobby Charles's family, through attorneys, filed a civil lawsuit against her. The criminal charges she faced were misdemeanor level compared to what had been done. No one has ever been charged with the killing of Kwawan Bobby Charles. Now let's be very specific about what this case represents beyond the individual facts, because the individual facts are inseparable from the context. October 2020 was a moment of maximum national attention to exactly this kind of case, to the deaths of black children and adults at the intersection of community isolation, law enforcement inaction, and the specific vulnerability of young black lives in rural southern communities. Bobby's case came at a moment when the country was, theoretically, watching. And yet the response from law enforcement in the initial days was slow enough that attorneys called it publicly inadequate. Yet no Amber Alert was issued, and the person whose conduct placed Bobby in the situation where he died faced misdemeanor charges. Here is the question that Bobby's family and their attorneys have asked publicly, and that has never been answered to their satisfaction. If Bobby had been a white child from a different neighborhood in Louisiana, would the Amber Alert have been issued? Would the search have begun faster? Would the official response have moved with more urgency in those first 24 to 48 hours when it might have made a difference? The Iberia Parish Sheriff tried to address the racial dimension directly and said publicly that the investigation was being conducted with all available resources, and that his team was following every lead. His statement did not address the Amber Alert question with specificity. It did not address why a 15-year-old child taken by strangers without parental consent did not trigger the kind of immediate, high-visibility emergency response that the system is designed to provide. Bobby Charles' parents, Kenneth Jacko and Roxanne Nelson, have continued to push for answers. His cousin Selena Charles became a public face of the family's demand for accountability. The ACLU of Louisiana called for an independent investigation. Activists and organizers flooded into Lareauville and Baldwin and the surrounding parishes, insisting that this case not become another file in a drawer. And yet the homicide investigation has not produced a murder charge. The person who took Bobby from his home faces charges that do not reflect the outcome of that night. His body was found in a sugarcane field 20 miles from where he lived, in inches of water, in a landscape he had no reason to be in. Bobby Charles liked video games. He was 15. He was in a new school, trying to find his way, in the middle of a pandemic that had made everything about being a teenager harder. He had a father who reported him missing the same night he disappeared. He had a family that fought for him loudly and publicly, and with everything they had. And the system, when it mattered most, when he was out there somewhere in South Louisiana needing to be found, moved at a pace that can't be justified by any theory except the one Bobby's family believes is true. He would be 20 years old today. He should be figuring out what comes after high school, arguing about music, learning to drive, calling his mom. He should be every ordinary thing that 20-year-olds are. His body was found in a sugarcane field, face down in inches of water, 20 miles from home. The man or woman who put him there has never been charged. And in the flat, wide sugar-cane country of Iberia Parish, the answer to what happened to Bobby Charles is still waiting to be spoken out loud by someone who knows. Before we begin this story, you need to know something. The woman at the center of it shares a name, an exact name, with a different person who is very much part of the American true crime conversation. The Missouri woman Pamela Hupp, convicted murderer, currently serving life in prison, whose story inspired a television miniseries and filled true crime podcasts for years. That woman, the one in a Missouri prison, is a different Pamela Hupp. Different person, different state, different story entirely. The Pamela Lee Hupp in this case never made headlines. She never appeared on true crime shows as a perpetrator. She wasn't a villain, she was a victim. And for 38 years she wasn't even a victim with a name. She was just a body in a lake. The coincidence of the shared name is extraordinary and, in its way, part of the tragedy. Because it means searches for her tend to surface the wrong story, the Missouri story. And the woman who floated in Lake Pontchartrain on a June morning in 1986 gets lost again, pushed down beneath the weight of a more famous name. This is her story. June 19, 1986, Lake Pontchartrain, Louisiana. The massive, shallow lake that sits just north of New Orleans, the one you cross on the causeway, the one that stretches so wide in every direction that you can lose sight of the shore and feel like you're at sea. On this morning, a fisherman is out on the water near the Interstate 10 twin-span bridges, the pair of bridges that carry traffic over the eastern end of the lake near Slidell, about 30 miles northeast of New Orleans. He sees something in the water. He approaches. It is a body, a woman, young, estimated between 20 and 30 years old at the time, though she would later be determined to be 28. She stands 5 feet 4 inches. She weighs 126 pounds. She is, to use the clinical language, floating near the I-10 twin span. The fisherman calls it in. St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's deputies respond. Her body is recovered. She is turned over to the coroner's office. The manner of death is ruled homicide. The cause is asphyxia. She was strangled or suffocated, or had the breath pressed out of her some other way by someone who put her in that lake. She is pregnant. The St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office confirms this in the announcement that finally gives her a name 38 years later. She was carrying a child when she died, and no one knows who she is. The investigation began in 1986 with everything that technology and manpower could offer in that era. Investigators had a body but no name. They had fingerprints but no match in any database. They had dental records that could confirm an identity but couldn't generate one. They had the physical description of a young woman in good health, 5'4", 126 pounds, probably between 20 and 28, whose last known address would turn out to be Fort Lauderdale, Florida. But in 1986, that address was unknown. Everything about her was unknown. The El Sue Faces Lab, one of the premier forensic identification facilities in the country, built a reconstruction of what her face would have looked like in life. They worked from her skull, from the bone structure and the measurements, and built back toward a human face. That reconstruction was released publicly. It was a photograph of a woman who might have been anyone who had the approximate features of someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone's partner. It was shown on America's Most Wanted, one of the most watched true crime programs in the country, a show that had cracked cold cases the official system had given up on. The reconstruction was shown to millions of people. Nobody came forward to identify her. For 38 years, she was known only as Lake Lady Jane Doe. Think about what those 38 years mean. The people who knew her in Fort Lauderdale aged from their 20s and 30s into their 60s. Some of them died. Some of them moved. Some of them probably saw the reconstruction and couldn't be certain and stayed quiet. Some of them may have known exactly who she was and chose, for whatever reason, not to say. The man or woman who put her in that lake went on with their life for 38 years. Probably, almost certainly, because nobody was charged, nobody was arrested. Nobody answered for the pregnant woman in Lake Pontchartrain. In September 2022, a grant from NAMUS, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, allowed the St. Tammany Parish Coroner's Office to submit biological material to Othram, a DNA laboratory in the Woodlands, Texas, that specializes in forensic-grade genome sequencing for cold cases. This is the new frontier of cold case resolution, the technology that is opening cases that the old toolkit couldn't crack. Othram extracted a DNA profile from Jane Doe's remains and ran it through genealogy databases, the same approach that has identified killers and victims in cases decades old across the country. They found family members. The genetic trail led to a family, and detectives made contact, and a DNA match confirmed what the science suggested. Lake Lady Jane Doe was Pamela Lee Hupp, also known in some records as Deborah Gale Justice. Born in April 1958, last known to live in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. She was 28 years old when she died. She was pregnant, and she had been floating in Lake Pontchartrain for 38 years before anyone knew her name. The announcement was made by the St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office in October 2024. After 38 years, she finally had a name. Sheriff Randy Smith made a statement that was both a tribute and a declaration of intent. He thanked the investigators who had worked the case over the decades. He thanked the technology that finally made identification possible. And he said clearly that his detectives would not stop working until they identified and arrested the person or persons responsible for Pamela Lee Hupp's death. But here is where the case sits right now. Her name is known, her identity is confirmed, but her killer or killers is not. The question of what brought a 28-year-old woman from Fort Lauderdale to Lake Pontchartrain, the question of who strangled a pregnant woman and dropped her body in the water near the twin-span bridges, the question of whether she knew her killer and trusted them, or was attacked by a stranger. None of those answers have been made public. The investigation is active and ongoing. Let's think about the geography for a moment, because it matters. Lake Pontchartrain is a crossroads lake. It separates New Orleans from the North Shore communities. The I-10 twin-span bridges carry enormous traffic volume. The lake is used for recreation, for fishing, for the daily transit of millions of people. Someone who dropped a body near those bridges was making a deliberate geographic choice, using the lake as a place of disposal, betting that the water would take the evidence down. The lake is large but shallow. It holds things in ways deep water doesn't. And on June 19, 1986, the lake gave her back. The question of how she got from Fort Lauderdale to Lake Pontchartrain is its own mystery. The gulf between those two places is significant. Florida to Louisiana means either driving, flying, or traveling by some other means across the states. It means she was in transit or she was brought somewhere. Her last known address was Fort Lauderdale, but she was found in St. Tammany Parish. The gap between those 2 points, geography and in time, is where the story of what happened to Pamela Lee Hupp lives. She also used the name Deborah Gale Justice. The use of an alias, or an alternative name, is itself a detail that opens questions rather than closing them. People use alternative names for many reasons, some practical, some protective, some born from circumstances that the official record doesn't capture. Was she running from something? Hiding from someone? Living under a different name to create distance from a life she was trying to leave? The use of 2 names suggests a complexity to her circumstances that we don't yet fully understand. She was pregnant. I keep returning to that fact. She was carrying a child. Someone killed a pregnant woman and put her in a lake. That level of violence, directed at someone in that particular state of vulnerability, is the kind of act that tends to have specific context behind it. Domestic violence statistics are unambiguous about the elevated danger pregnancy represents. The relationship between the victim and the killer in cases like this is far more often intimate than random. Not always, but far more often. Pamela Lee Hupp was born in April 1958. She would be 66 years old today if she had lived. The child she was carrying would be 38 years old, a middle-aged person who exists in the theoretical only because someone decided that they and their mother should not exist at all. The reconstruction that the Faces Lab built from her skull, the image that was shown on America's Most Wanted and shared across decades of cold case databases, is now something that can be set beside a real name. Lake Lady Jane Doe is Pamela Lee Hupp. She was 28. She was from Fort Lauderdale. She was pregnant. She was killed by asphyxia. She was put in a lake. And 38 years later, science gave her back her name. The killer is still out there, if still alive. The circumstances that brought Pamela Hupp to Lake Pontchartrain are still unknown. The investigation is ongoing. The name is known. The justice is not. Lake Pontchartrain is still there, of course. The twin-span bridges still carry their daily traffic, thousands of cars an hour. People moving between New Orleans and Slidell and Mandeville on the North Shore, none of them thinking about the morning in 1986 when a fisherman found a young woman in the water below. So the waves widen still, and it holds things longer than you'd think. Pamela Lee Hupp was found by a fisherman. She was unnamed for 38 years. She was finally given back her name in 2024, and now someone needs to answer for what was taken from her on the shore of that lake on a warm Louisiana June night, decades ago, when she was 28 years old and carrying a child and no one knew she was gone. It's April 1st, 1988, and yes, April Fool's Day. The cruel irony of that date sits in this case like a stone, because the last confirmed moment of Cassandra Ann Lalonde's life on this earth is tied to a day when the entire country is primed to dismiss things as jokes, as pranks, as nothing to take seriously. And for a 15-year-old girl from Louisiana's lower delta, that date may have meant everything. Boras, Louisiana. If you've never been to Boras, let me tell you what it is. It's at the very bottom of the state, deep in the boot, where the Mississippi River makes its final push toward the Gulf of Mexico. Plaquemines Parish. This is fishing and shrimping country. Seafood boats. In the bayou, men who smell like brine and diesel. A tight insular community built around the water, around in the port, around the kind of life that outsiders don't fully understand. It is beautiful in a desolate way. Flat and wide and open. The kind of place where the sky takes up more of your vision than the land. Candy, as everyone called her, was from West Wago, a suburb of New Orleans about 65 miles north of Boras. But she was known to travel to Boras. She had connections there, people she knew through the seafood and fishing world that wove through this whole region. She was 15 years old, brown hair, brown eyes, 5 feet 2 inches, about 100 to 110 pounds. She had pierced ears and a large scar on one of her legs, near or above the knee, from a time she'd been cut by something sharp underwater, the kind of injury a bayou kid gets, and had been taken to the ER by her foster parents for stitches. She smoked cigarettes. She was 15, and she left on the back of a motorbike on April 1st, 1988, with a man named David, headed for Alabama. There is a detail in this case that I want you to hold in your mind from the very beginning. Candy was in the foster care system. She had foster parents. She was not, in the traditional sense, embedded in the kind of family infrastructure that generates immediate, loud, and powerful responses when a child goes missing. The system had already shuffled her around once. She was a teenager with a complicated life in a small insular community. And when she disappeared, the formal machinery of concern moved at the speed that it often does for kids like Candy, which is to say, not fast enough. She left on that motorbike with a man named David. That's the name we have. David, no last name in the public record. No description of him beyond the bike and the direction of travel. Just David, a motorbike in Alabama. Months passed. Her family heard nothing. Not a call, not a letter, not a rumor from anyone who'd seen her. And then, in July 1988, after Candy had already turned 16 in June, her loved ones received a phone call. The caller was a man named Salvatore. He gave them a story. He said he was a worker on a seafood boat operating out of Buras, the same port community Candy had been connected to. He said he drove a green truck with a camper top, the kind of vehicle that has a sleeping area built into the bed, the kind you could live out of if you needed to. He said he had been living with Candy in a rural home outside Mobile, Alabama, a home with no neighbors for miles. He said he and Candy had gotten into an argument. He said she had left to take a walk to cool down. He said she left her cigarettes behind. He said she left a purse behind, and he said she never came back. Stop right there, because this is the story that should make every alarm in your body start firing. Let's go through it slowly. A grown man calls a missing 15-year-old girl's family, not to report her missing, not to ask for help finding her, but to explain why she's gone. He calls not to raise a flag, but to lower one. To say essentially, don't look too hard for her, she walked off on her own. She's somewhere. She'll turn up. But she left her purse behind, and her cigarettes. Candy smoked. Smokers do not voluntarily walk away from their cigarettes when they step out for some air. That's not how it works. You grab your pack, you grab your purse. Those are the two things you take with you when you step outside. If those items are sitting in the walk was not voluntary. Now let's talk about who Salvatore was, or who he claimed to be. He said he worked on a seafood boat in Buras. Candy had connections to Buras. This was not a random stranger. This was a man embedded in the exact community Candy had been navigating, the fishing and shrimping world of South Louisiana. Someone who worked the boats would have had contact with the network of people who passed through Buras, who knew who was on the docks, who was new, who was looking for a ride or a place to crash. A man like that would have had every opportunity to encounter a 15-year-old girl traveling on the back of someone's motorbike with no fixed destination. Here is another detail that sits badly. The property in Alabama, the rural home with no neighbors for miles. That description is either a statement of fact or it is a statement of strategic geography. A home with no neighbors for miles means no witnesses. No one to see who came and went. No one to hear what happened. No one to notice a girl who stopped coming outside. If something happened to Candy at that location, the isolation of the property is both a practical obstacle to discovery and a deliberate feature of the place where she was taken. The property was eventually searched. Investigators excavated parts of the land. They found nothing. Candy was not buried there, or if she was not found. But the search confirmed one thing. She had been there. She had passed through that place, and then she was gone. Here is what we know about the man named David. Almost nothing. His name is in the record. He had a motorbike. He left Buras heading toward Alabama with Candy on April 1st, 1988. And then he disappears from the narrative entirely, swapped out by the time Salvatore calls in July, as if David handed off whatever responsibility he had for this girl to someone else. Or as if David is Salvatore, or as if David is a name someone used that doesn't even belong to a real person with a searchable identity. The overlap between David and Salvatore is never fully explained in the public record. Did Candy go from one man to another? Was David just the person who gave her a ride? Was Salvatore the man she ended up with, the boat worker in the green camper truck, and David a separate person entirely? Or were they the same person operating under different names in a community where nicknames and aliases were common? The record doesn't say. The record just gives us two names, one motorbike, one phone call, one story about a walk that didn't end, and then silence. Now let's talk about Candy's family. She had siblings. She had a mother. Her family members have said publicly, over the years, that they are certain she would not have stayed away willingly, that she was close to her siblings, that the bond between them was real and would have pulled her back. The framing of her as a runaway, a label that was almost certainly applied early in this case given her age and the nature of her disappearance, is one her family rejects. You don't stay gone for 37 years because you had a fight with a boyfriend. You don't leave your purse and cigarettes and not eventually come home. Let me tell you about the geography of this case, because Louisiana geography always matters. Buras is at the bottom of the world. The lower Mississippi Delta is a place of extraordinary physical isolation, cut through by waterways, connected by narrow roads built on levees, surrounded by marshland that will swallow almost anything dropped into it. From Burroughs to Mobile, Alabama, you're traveling northeast through some of the most remote country in the American South. Gulf Coast Highway, coastal Mississippi, rural Alabama. This is not a route with many witnesses, not a route with surveillance cameras, not a route that anyone is monitoring for the transit of a teenage girl on the back of a motorbike with a man whose name might be David. Picture St. Martin, Louisiana. You need to understand this place before you understand what happened here. St. Martinville sits on the banks of the Bayou Teche, deep in the Cajun heart of south-central Louisiana. It is one of the oldest towns in the state, a place so steeped in French and Creole history that it still holds a kind of old-world stillness. The Evangeline Oak stands at the edge of the bayou, the famous tree where the legend of Evangeline ends, where the Acadian girl waits for her lost love and waits until she dies waiting. It is a town built on the story of someone who waited for someone who never came back. On August 2nd, 1986, a 19-year-old woman named Judy Ann Gary walked out of her mother's house to go to the pharmacy. She was caring for her mother, who was ill. Her mother needed prescription medication. This was not an errand of pleasure or leisure. This was a daughter doing what daughters do, tending to a sick parent, walking to the local drugstore to pick up pills that would make her feel better. It was a simple walk down to the hospital drugstore at 410 North Main Street, the kind of pharmacy that sits at the center of small-town life, the place where everybody knows the pharmacist, and the pharmacist knows everybody's business. Judy was 19 years old. She was married. She had a child. Her son, Ricky, was 1 year and 8 months old. She had a husband named Eric. She had a whole small life built in the town where she'd grown up, the kind of life that has its complications and its dailiness and its ordinary moments. A sick mother, a toddler, a marriage, a pharmacy run on a summer afternoon. She was 5 feet 2 inches tall. She had green eyes and black hair. She is sometimes referred to as Eugenia Gary in cold case databases, though she was known to family as Judy. She walked to the pharmacy on foot that August afternoon. She got the prescription, and then pharmacy workers saw her get into a green 4-door car with an unknown person, and she was never seen again. Let me put that in the kind of sharp, specific focus this moment deserves. She was inside the pharmacy. The transaction happened. The prescription was retrieved. She walked out the front door of the hospital drugstore on North Main Street, and she got into a car. She knew the person well enough to get in without hesitation. The staff watched it happen. They noted the car, green, 4-door, and then the car drove away from the pharmacy, away from St. Martinville, and Judy Gary was gone. A genetic genealogist named Renee Dunn, who would eventually get involved in this case decades later, put it in the simplest possible terms. She apparently knew the persons, got in with no problem, and that was it. That's the sentence that defines this case. No struggle, no hesitation. No sign of coercion visible to the witnesses inside the pharmacy. She got in, no problem, and that was it. Now let's talk about who was left behind. Her son Ricky was 1 year and 8 months old. He grew up without his mother. He grew up in foster care, taken in by a woman named Tamika Thario when he was 14. He grew up knowing only that his mother went to the pharmacy and never came back. When Renee Dunn eventually found him and began working his mother's case, he said something that stays with you. He said he tried twice before to get help, to get resources, to get someone to pay attention to what happened to Judy Gary. He didn't have the means, he didn't have the connections. The case sat untouched for 30 years, while Judy's son grew from a toddler who couldn't even remember her face into a man who just wanted answers. 30 years. That's how long this case sat before anyone with the tools to investigate it properly turned their attention to it. 30 years during which Judy Gary's mother probably died wondering what happened to her daughter. 30 years during which her husband Eric lived with that green car and that pharmacy doorway and the specific quality of not knowing that wears people down at a cellular level. When the St. Martinville Police Department finally reopened the case, the chief said the hardest part was that it had been so long. There was no physical evidence left to work with, no forensics, no crime scene. The pharmacy where she was last seen is gone. The building at 410 North Main Street no longer houses a drugstore. The particular intersection of memory and place that might have produced a witness, a detail, a fragment of the truth, has been erased by decades of ordinary time. But here is what the detective and the genealogist did find when they started pulling on the threads. 5 witnesses. When the case was officially reopened, investigators identified 5 potential witnesses who might have information about what happened to Judy Gary on August 2nd, 1986. 5 people who had been holding something for 30 years, sitting with whatever they knew or thought they knew, in a town of roughly 7,000 people where everyone knows everyone, and secrets have a way of being kept precisely because of that intimacy rather than in spite of it. In a small town, the calculus of what you say to police about what you know is always complicated. You might know the person in the green car, you might have gone to school with them, their cousin might be your neighbor, their mother might be your mother's friend, and Judy Gary, a 19-year-old woman, a mother, a wife, someone picking up her sick mother's medication, someone who got into a car without hesitation, deserved better than 30 years of silence in a town that holds its stories the way the Bayou Teche holds the water, deep and still and without a lot of visible movement. Here's what we don't know, and this is the most important list in this case. We don't know who was driving that green 4-door car. We don't know if Judy Gary arrived at her destination safely and was harmed afterward, or if the car itself was the site of the violence. We don't know if she was taken somewhere specific or somewhere random. We don't know if her body is in the parish or out of it, in the bayou or in the ground. We don't know if she is alive somewhere, though after 38 years that possibility becomes vanishingly thin. We don't know any of the most essential things. We just know she got into a car and the car drove away. There is something about the absolute plainness of this errand that makes the case feel uniquely unbearable. She wasn't anywhere that carried risk. She wasn't making a late-night decision or navigating something complicated. She was walking to the pharmacy in the afternoon for her sick mother. That is the most ordinary act of care imaginable. A daughter doing a daughter's work. A young woman who loved her mother enough to walk out in August Louisiana heat to get her medicine. The connection to the pharmacy is also significant in a way that the plain facts don't immediately surface. The hospital drugstore in St. Martinville was a community gathering place, the kind of local institution where people talked and lingered, where the staff knew the regular customers and the regular customers knew each other. If Judy walked in and walked out into a known person's car, that person was embedded in her world, not a stranger, someone from St. Martinville or near it, someone connected to her daily life, someone the pharmacy workers recognized as part of the familiar background of the community. Otherwise, they would have noted something unusual, rather than simply watching her get in with no problem. Her son, Ricky, who grew up not knowing what happened to his mother, said he just wants answers. That's the whole of his statement, he wants to know. Not necessarily justice, though certainly that too, but first the simple truth of what happened in that parking lot on North Main Street on an August afternoon in 1986. He was a year and 8 months old. He grew up in the care of a woman who wasn't his mother. He has carried the absence of Judy Gary his entire life, and all he wants is the answer to a question that someone in St. Martinville almost certainly already knows. Judy Ann Gary would be in her late 50s today if she's alive. The people who knew her in 1986 are older now, some of them sick, some of them dying, some of them already gone. The window for human memory in this case is closing in the same way all human windows close. Every year the silence holds, another possible witness ages past the point of usefulness. Every year the answer lives in fewer brains, in fewer consciences, in fewer hearts that still remember the details of a summer afternoon when a young woman got into a green car and the car drove away and Ricky Richard grew up without his mother. The Evangeline Oak is still standing in St. Martinville. The legend of waiting is still attached to it, the story of someone who waited for someone who never came back. Judy Gary's family has been waiting for 38 years. Her son has been waiting his whole life, and somewhere in this old, storied, memory-soaked town, someone knows which direction that green car went.